So, hello everyone. As you might have noticed, I've been inactive on YouTube for quite a while as a lot of stuff has been on my plate. So, now I've been trying to read a couple of papers and I decided maybe I could just record the process along the way. So, first of all, full disclaimer, this paper I read already a couple of months ago, and due to some reasons, I need to review it. So, I'll just brush up and try to maybe explain the stuff and why it's being done along the way. So the paper is titled CONAN, Counter Narratives to Niche Sourcing, a multilingual dataset of responses to fight online hate speech. So essentially they created a dataset in the paper. The author names are Yiling Shung, Elisabetta Kuzumenko, Sarah Sinem Tekiroglu, and Marco Guerini. I'm really sorry if I mispronounce those names. So let's just move ahead. Okay, so let's start with the abstracts. So although there is an unprecedented effort to provide adequate response in terms of laws and policies to hate content on social media platforms, dealing with hatred online is still a tough problem, of course. So tackling hate in the standard way of content deletion uh, is often so when they try to enforce censorship, people of course come up with the argument of freedom of expression, and overblocking also is not really a good strategy, because if you censor overblock a lot, then people just create new ideas. You're not really uh, solving the root problem. So one alternate strategy that has received little attention is to generate counter narratives. Okay, so this paper at the time when this was written, this thing was not being done a lot. So counter narratives are essentially you create a response to the hate speech, and you post that in say a platform like Twitter, and you try to influence the people who are supporting that message by providing them the right perspective. So, in this paper, the authors describe the creation of the first large scale multilingual expert based dataset of hate speech and counter speech narrative pairs. This dataset has been built with the effort of more than 100 NGO operators from three different NGOs, and that applied their training and expertise to the task. So you can see how huge of an effort this was. Together with the collected data, we also provide additional annotations. So they also provide data about the expert demographics, the hate and response type, data augmentation through translation, paraphrasing. So these are all the things which they've done in this paper. Okay, I forgot the right way to highlight. Okay, so moving ahead. So finally, we provide initial experiments to assess the quality of our data. So they run a few models, but they do not like focus a lot on the model part. Their main aim in this paper is to create a multilingual data set of responses to hate speech. So future models can be built on them, and you can see they've done a serious job, because taken a lot of they've put up a lot of effort in coordinating and doing this stuff. All right. So together with the rapid growth of social media, the amount of user-generated content is steadily increasing, of course. So at the same time, abusive and offensive language can spread quickly and is difficult to monitor, of course. So I'll just be skimming through the text. UNESCO, so they've given the UNESCO definition of hate speech. So these are expressions that advocate incitement to harm based upon the targets being identified with a certain social or demographic group. Okay, so this is quite important. People have this misconception with hate speech. Suppose I have a friend, and he and amongst friends, people usually use words which they would not with other people, right? So maybe those words are some not intended to be used in say that fashion, but it's used. So many say abusive words are also used amongst friends a lot. But suppose I use that same word to target a person, not based on not selectively targeting the person, but based on his social group. That would constitute hate speech. If I target just a particular person, and my intent is not to target the entire social or demographic group, that is not considered hate speech according to this definition. So harm based upon the target being identified with a certain social group. Right. So this is an important definition. I'll just highlight this. So victims of hate speech are usually targeted because of various aspects such as gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, physical appearance, etc. So, for example, this hate speech is there, and I won't be reading out the hate speech messages, of course. So, online hate speech can deepen prejudice and stereotypes, and bystanders may receive false messages and consider them correct. So, this is the point which people want to raise. If some, say, huge celebrity spreads some false information or fake news, then you can see that it penetrates the social network a lot more. If, say, some no name had posted some random fake news, so that is what they're trying to show. So one abbreviation which will be followed is social media platforms are called SMP, and governmental organizations have elicited unprecedented attention to take adequate actions against hate speech by implementing laws and policies, but they're not really effective. So the standard approach used on social media platforms is to suspend the user accounts, and but this brings in the problem of trying to weigh in hate, right to freedom of speech against censorship, right? So another strategy which had received little attention at this point of time when this paper was published was using counter narratives. Right now, counter narratives are a hugely hot topic and a topic of active research. So, a counter narrative, sometimes called a counter comment or a counter speech, is a response that provides non negative feedback through fact bound arguments, right? And is considered as the most effective approach to withstand hate speech. So, let me just highlight this part as well, right? So, this is the definition of counter narratives. So, in fact, it preserves the right to freedom of speech because it is not enforcing censorship on the person who spread the hate speech, but it is giving evidence, credible evidence being the main point. It's not creating fake data or synthetic data to sort of mislead the people, and it is added in the conversation to see how the people to give the people a choice to choose their opinions correctly. So, suppose if someone is propagating some hate speech, saying that some law is going to come or something of that sort, right? And suppose our automated systems generate a couple of messages which straight up just uh, fact check the statement or just clarify that this is fake news or this is wrong and you are factually incorrect, then a person who might just stumble upon the conversation would read the thread and would gain insights as well, and then has the choice to actively go up and maybe research on his own when he sees multiple point of views. So it can alter the viewpoints of haters and bystanders as well by encouraging the exchange of opinions and mutual understanding, and can help de-escalate the conversation. So a counter narrative such as the one in sentence 2 is a non-negative appropriate response to sentence 1, while the one in sentence 3 is not, since it escalates the conversation. Okay. Yeah, so this note is there. It is crucial that this paper contains examples of language which may be offensive to some readers. They are not the views of the authors nor mine. These are just research examples. So for that particular hate speech, these are two counter speech which can be produced. But this one is a bit say aggressive, if I may use that word. So this might not de-escalate the situation. So even amongst the different types of counter speech, you need to choose the right counter speech. So in this respect, some NGOs are tackling hatred online by training operators to monitor the social media platforms and generate appropriate counter speeches whenever necessary. However, manual intervention is still a toil, and automation is the way to go, because you cannot really say monitor hundreds and thousands and millions of conversations on tons of different social media platforms. You have Facebook, you have Reddit, you have Instagram, you have Twitter, you have now Coup and many other different platforms. So as a first step in the direction, they've tried to collect data and try to make that data accessible to more researchers so that they can build models on that data. So they've worked with three different NGOs, and they've done something called niche sourcing. So niche sourcing is a specific form of outsourcing that harnesses the computational efforts from a niche group of experts rather than the faceless crowd. So they are outsourcing the work, but just to a group of experts. So I'll just highlight this part as well. Yeah. So niche sourcing combines the strengths of the crowd with those of professionals. So in the case of this paper, they organized several data collection sessions with NGO operators. They were trained and they were specialized. They were trained to write counter narratives that was meant to fight hatred and de-escalate the conversation. So the counter speech in the dataset would try to resemble this more over the second one, right? So, in this way, they created the first large scale multilingual publicly available expert based dataset, a huge thing to take in. So, of hate speech and counter narrative pairs for English, French, and Italian. And their focus was on the phenomenon of Islamophobia. And the construction of the dataset involved more than 100 operators and more than 500 person hours of data collection. After the data collection phase, they hired three non-expert annotators. So first of all, data was collected of hate speech versus counter speech, and then those annotators they performed the additional tasks, which took around 200 person hours of work, and it did not require the specific domain expertise. So they had to paraphrase the original hate comment to augment the number of pairs per language. They wanted to annotate hate content subtopic. So what uh, exactly is the subtopic of the hate content and the counter narrative type? So all of these will be discussed further down. So what are the counter narrative types? What are the different subtopics of hate comment? And they also had to translate content from Italian and French to English. So they have parallel data across languages. So the same hate speech in Italian or French might be used in some other NLP model. And the additional annotation grants that the data set can be released for several NLP tasks related to hate speech. Right. So this stuff makes sense, I guess. And the remainder of the paper is structured as follows. They discuss the related work on hate speech. Then they discuss or they introduce the CONAN dataset. They provide some descriptive, quantitative, and qualitative analysis, and then they suggest future works. So just like any other standard paper, they've followed the same structure. Right. So first of all, let's go to the related works. So with regard to hated online, we focus on three research aspects. So they looked at publicly available datasets already present. They looked at the different methodologies which can be used to detect hate speech, and they use at the seminal works that focus on countering hate speech. Right. So first of all, the different hate datasets. So several datasets are available, which are usually binary annotations. So basically, you will have a ton of messages, and each message will be marked whether it is hate speech or not hate speech. So a 1 or 0 classifier. Again, there are also several shared tasks that have released a dataset for hate speech detection in different languages. So there is one on German, or one on misogyny identification in Italian, and so on. They have Spanish ones as well. They also have bilingual hate speech datasets. So datasets which are bilingual between Spanish and English. Also, they have the dataset by Wasim and Hovi, which released 16,000 annotated tweets, which contain three offensive types: sexist tweets, racist tweets, and tweets which lied in neither of the categories. Also, there was another dataset, a German dataset, which had 541 tweets targeting refugee crisis, and they offered insights for the improvement of hate speech detection by providing multiple labels for each hate speech. Right. So due to copyright limitations, hate speech datasets are distributed as a list of tweet IDs, making them ephemeral and prone to data loss. So why is it prone to data loss, you might wonder. So basically, when you are providing only the Twitter IDs or the tweet IDs, then this might be a problem, because in the future, the tweet might just be removed or deleted or censored, or even blocked. The user account might be blocked by the social media platform. So that induces data loss, because now the tweets in the dataset, you might have 10,000 tweets, but 2,000 of them might already be gone by the time you get about to use that. So for this reason, they created a multilingual, multi-turn annotated WhatsApp dataset for Italian on cyberbullying, using simulation session with teenagers to overcome the data collection and loss problem. So basically, this dataset would now remain forever, because this is not dependent on some social media platform. Alright. So now let's have a look at the hate detection methods already there. So there are many different works. Uh, okay, there are supervised approaches to tackle hate speech detection on social media platforms, including blogs, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Right. The predominant approach are to build a classifier trained on various features derived from lexical resources. So lexical resources means the different lexical properties of the text, so the text length and so on. They used n-grams as well. N-grams are basically if you uh, split the sentence, say I am a boy, right? And if you create 1 grams, then unigrams would be different words. I am a boy. All of them are individually unigrams. But if you create say bigrams, then bigrams would be I am a boy and so on. So these are n-grams. So if you have size n, then you have n-grams. They also use knowledge base or to utilize deep neural networks, right? So in addition, other approaches have been proposed to detect subcategories of hate speech, such as anti-black and racist hate speech. They were studied by Silva et al. The prevalent hate categories and targets on Twitter and Whisper, but limited hate speech only to form the of the form. Okay, so this studied the different hate speech types and categories. So they try to identify the targets and categories on Twitter, but they only looked at hate speech which followed the following form. So I, intensity, user intent, and any word. So you can probably just pause the video and try out a few combinations, and you'll know what sort of hate speech content fits this template. So a comprehensive overview of recent approach on hate speech detection using NLP can be found in these papers. Yeah. So now let's look at hate countering. So lastly, we should mention that a limited number of studies have been conducted on counter narratives. True. So this paper by Matthew et al. They collected YouTube comments that contain counter narratives to YouTube video of hatred. So essentially, you've all probably encountered some YouTube video where there are toxic comments, and in those reply threads they looked for counter narratives. Another group of researchers studied the effectiveness of counter narrative on Facebook via a simulation model. Another paper studied how some arguments among strangers induce favorable change in discourse and attitudes. And to our knowledge, there exists only one very recent seminal work focusing on the idea of collecting hate message and counter narrative pairs from Twitter. They used a simple pattern, so they did not go full out like this paper. So they first extract hate speech, hate tweets, and then manually annotate the counter narratives in the response. Still, they had several shortcomings, which you can guess why, because they're using such a rigid template. Okay, so this dataset already lost more than 60% of the pairs in a small interval. This is the problem which I discussed earlier. Tweet IDs were distributed and tweets are deleted. It is only in English, so people from different people researchers researching in different languages would not be able to leverage the dataset. It was collected from a specific template which I discussed, and many of these answers came from ordinary web users and contain, for example, offensive text that do not meet the de-escalation intent of NGOs. So if you, it's like adding fuel to the fire, right? That would be probably be a correct proverb. If if there's some person who's spreading hate speech, and you outright abuse him and expect that he would agree with you, then that there's no chance he would. So considering these works, they can reasonably the authors reasonably state that there is no suitable corpora currently for counter narratives. So they tried to build one in this paper, and they also shared the GitHub repository. And if you go there, you can see that this paper has the hit data set, I believe somewhere here. Okay, yep. So loading it would be a difficult task right now. I'll have to download it and all, but I guess you get the sense of what the dataset is like already. So just the general stuff. So the fundamental of the dataset, considering the shortcomings of the existing datasets. So the dataset is copy-free data. So they release the copy-free textual data so that this data can be directly used. Uh, they are not releasing tweet IDs that would be lost. It is multilingual, English, French, and Italian, expert based because the counter narrative pairs are created by good en- by good NGOs in three different countries: UK, France, and Italy. So they are expert based and composed by operators who are specifically trained to compose this, and they are protecting the operator's identity. So they will not disclose who are the operators who are annotating, because if they do, they might be vulnerable to online attacks. So this might be the case if we were to collect their real SMP activities following a procedure. Therefore, our data collection was based on simulated SMP activity. Right. So essentially, what they're trying to say is, if they were they did not they use some different method other than this paper to protect the identity and demographic based metadata. So essentially they've given different uh, demographic information about the tweeter, the person who made the tweet, so the gender, age, education level, to personalize or to personally tailor the counter narrative to the different for different persons. So maybe if there's an 80-year-old man, you might need to use a different way of explaining it to him, while as compared to say a 20-year-old person. Okay, so now they discuss the set collection process. So we have followed the same data collection procedure for each language to grant the same conditions and comparability of results. So this is the process essentially. For each language, they asked two native speakers to write around 50 prototypical Islamophobic short texts, hate texts. Okay, this step was used to ensure that the sample uniformity covers the typical arguments against Islam as much as possible. So they are trying to create as many diverse hate speech texts as possible, and they can distribute this to the NLP community so that they can be ready to create counter narratives to different types of attacks. Okay, so the preparation of the data collection forms. So they prepared three online forms, one per language, with the same instruction for the operators translated in the corresponding language. Okay, for each language, they prepared two forms. In the first, users can respond to hate text prepared by NGO trainers. In the second, users can write their own hate text and counter narratives at the same time. Right. So in each form, operators were asked to anonymously provide the demographic, age profile, including age, gender, and education level. Secondly, to compose up to 5 counter narratives for each text. So I guess this was quite self-explanatory. And in the counter narrative instructions, the operators were already trained to follow the guidelines of the NGOs. So for creating proper counter narratives, there were many guidelines. They The guidelines they followed were similar to the ones followed by Get the Trolls Out project. These guidelines emphasize using fact-bound argument and non-offensive language. So they do not want to escalate the situation, and they want to provide facts, which would which would be much more effective. Furthermore, for the specific data collection task, operators were asked to allow their intuitions without overthinking and to compose reasonable responses. The motivation for this was to collect as much diverse data as possible, since for current AI technologies, deep learning technologies require a huge quantity and quality of data, which should be of good quality, because both of them work hand in hand. With only a few good quality examples, you cannot create a reasonably good model, and with tons of poor quality examples, you cannot create a good model. So other than this instruction and the fact of using a form instead of responding on a social media platform, operators carried out their normal counter messaging activities. So this makes sense. And the sessions for each language, the authors performed 3 data collection sessions on different days. Each session lasted roughly 3 hours and had a variable number of operators, usually around 20. So operators are different from NGO trainers and might change across sessions. Okay. Operators were gathered in the same room with a computer and briefed and received a brief information from the NGO trainer. This operation was about a specific counter narrative collection task, and they were told whatever they're supposed to do. Right. So now comes the data augmentation annotation part. So after the data collection phase, they hired three non-expert annotators that I'm sorry about that. So they hired three non-expert annotators that performed additional work. So this work did not require any specialization. So in this work, they paraphrased the original hate content to augment the number of pairs per language. So this when they now they could generate more pairs. They annotated the hate speech subtopic and counter narrative type, and they translated content from French and Italian to English. So they have parallel data across languages. So they have the same hate speech across different languages. And to guarantee the quality, after the annotation augmentation phase, a validation procedure has been conducted by NGO trainers, and they validated the data. So paraphrasing. Recent deep learning approaches are data hungry, and data augmentation is a way to mitigate a problem. For instance, to improve text classification performance for sexism, new tweets are generated by replacing words in original tweets with synonyms from ConceptNet. Right. Other examples are back translation, gold standard, repetition. They have been used in sequence to sequence machine translation. In all these tasks, adding the synthetic pairs to the original dataset always results in significant improvements in the performance. So, if you've not been under a rock and you know about computer vision also uses data augmentation techniques. Of course, they're different from natural language processing. Their techniques may include, say, rotating the image, random cropping, adding some blurs, and so on and so forth. So, in line with the idea of artificially augmenting pairs, and since in our dataset we have many responses for few hate speeches, we produced two manual paraphrases of each hate speech and paired them with the counter narratives of the original one. Therefore, we increased the number of R pairs by three times in each language. So, artificial augmentation increased the dataset thrice by three folds. Then again, they have the annotation part. So they asked to label the counter narratives with types. So these are the types which they have: presentation of facts, pointing out hypocrisy, and so on and so forth. And with respect to the original guidelines, they we asked a new type of counter narrative called counter question to cover expression replies using a question that can be thought provoking or asking for more evidence from the hate speaker. So this was that. In fact, a preliminary analysis showed that this category is quite frequently used among operator responses. Finally, each counter narrative can be labeled with more than one type, thus making the annotation more fine-grained. So, the same one could be pointing out hypocrisy while presenting facts. So, two annotators per language annotate all the counter narratives independently. A reconciliation phase was then performed for the disagreement cases. So these are some examples. These are the guidelines. Don't be abusive. Think about the objectives. Call for influential users. Use credible evidence and think about the tone. And these are the counter narratives. So, for instance, in this counter narrative, someone is claiming the hate speech might be that every Muslim is a potential terrorist, and the counter narrative very validly just counters this. So, every Muslim is also a potential peacemaker, doctor, philanthropist. What is your point? This is pointing out, this is the cross questioning part as well. This would probably on a deeper level uh, make the person question himself or herself. And let's just move on. I cannot read all of those, they are very offensive. Okay. Then they have the hate speech subtopic annotation. So the hate speech can also be of different types. So it can be culture based, economic based, crime based. Then we have terrorism, oppression, history, and so on and so forth. So there were again annotators who did this task. And then for the parallel corpus, they translated the text, and this was pretty standard. Okay, so now they discuss the statistics for the data set. So they had more than 500 hours of data collection, so on and so forth, 4078 pairs, 1288 for English, 1719 for French, and 1071 for Italian. And at least 111 operators participated in the 9 data collection sessions. And each counter narrative needed about 8 minutes on average to be composed. The paraphrasing of hate messages and the translation of French and Italian pairs to English brought the total number of pairs to more than 15,000. Regarding the token length of counter narratives, we observed that there is consistency. For French, 14 tokens on average, 21 for Italian and English. So this basically means that on average a counter speech has 21 words. So considering counter narrative lengths in terms of characters, only a small portion, only 2% for English and so on, contain more than 280 characters, which is the character limit per message in Twitter. So they are basically trying to see how many of them would not be able to fit in a single tweet. And which is one of the key social media platforms for hate speech research. You'll see Twitter is used a lot, like really a lot. And these are the statistics. So you have the counter narrative for hate speech, the mean, the standard deviation, and so then you add the augmented words, then you have the mean and standard deviation, and so on and so forth. Right. Regarding demographic, the majority of responses were written by operators, which held a bachelor's or higher degree. There's a good balance in response with regards to declared gender, with a slight predominance of those written by female operators in English and Italian, while a slight predominance of counter narratives written by male operators in French. Finally, the predominant age bin is 21 to 30 for English and Italian. Right. So this is the demographic of the operators. So only 5%. So how would you use this table? So for Italian, and you want to see how many of them were aged more, uh, had their ages greater than 60, then you'll have only 5%. Then these are the different counter narrative type distributions across the three languages. And considering the annotation task, we give the distribution of counter narrative types per language in table 5. So you can see that there is consistency across the languages, such that facts, question, denouncing, and hypocrisy are the most frequent ones. Before the reconciliation phase, the agreements between the annotators was moderated. Cohen's kappa 0.55 over the three languages. I don't know, but believe this is a statistical measure which can be, you can just look it up. So this can be partially explained by the complexity of the messages that often fall under more than one category. So two labels were assigned in more than 50% of the categories. On the other hand, for hate speech subtopic annotation, the agreement between the annotator was very high even before the reconciliation phase. So a possible reason is that such messages represent short and prototypical hate arguments as explicitly requested to the NGO trainers. So in fact, the vast majority has only one label. So this is for the hate speech annotation, but for counter narratives, uh, the lines are much more blurry and they can lie in multiple ones. But hate speech was specifically created to for to be short and concise and target and probably have only a few target labels. So this is the distribution for hate speech. So now the evaluation. So in order to assess the quality of dataset, they ran a lot of experiments. The first experiment was meant to assess how natural a pair is. So they administered 120 pairs to the subjects to be evaluated. 20 were kept so that they have an upper bound representing original pairs. In 50 pairs, they replace the hate speech with a paraphrase, and 51 remaining pairs they randomly match a hate speech with a counter narrative from another hate speech. So results showed that 85% of the time in the original condition, hate speech and counter narratives were clearly tied, followed by 74% of the time in paraphrase, while only 4% of the unrelated baseline. So this shows that when they were randomly swapped, then they were not really identified to be a pair. So this is a statistically significant difference. The probability is less than 0.001 with respect to the chi-square test. This indicates that the quality of augmented pairs is almost as good as one of original pairs. Okay, so now the augmentation for counter narrative selection. So once we assessed the quality of augmented pairs, they focused on possible contribution of the paraphrases. So they collected a small sample of natural tweets and so on, and manually selected those that were effectively hate speeches. They then compared two TF-IDF response retrieval models by calculating the TF-IDF matrix using the following document variants: hate speech and counter narrative, hate speech and its two phrases, and counter narrative. So if you're not familiar with TF-IDF matrices, I would suggest you look it up. It's Not a very difficult concept, but it's not something which I'm looking to go into right now. The final response for a given sample tweet is calculated by finding the highest score among the cosine similarities between the TF-IDF vectors of the sample and all documents in a model. For all 100 natural hate tweets, we then provided two answers selected from our English database. Annotators were then asked to evaluate the responses with respect to their relevancy. And results showed that introducing the augmented data provides 9% increase in the percentage of agreed very relevant responses. So this provides a statistically significant improvement. This result is especially encouraging since it shows that augmented data can help in improving even a basic model. So what they're essentially trying to convey is paraphrasing and adding paraphrased messages actually increase the content of the dataset as well as improve the performance of different models on the dataset. For in this case, a TF-IDF. So impacts of demographics. The final experiment was designed to assess whether demographic information can have effects. So if you remember, they collected a demographic. So they selected a sample of 230 pairs written by 4 male and 4 female operators that were controlled for age. So they were in the same age range. Then they presented this to subjects with each pair in isolation and asked them to state whether they would definitely use a particular counter narrative for that hate speech or not. And note that in this case, we did not ask whether the counter narrative was relevant, but whether if they would use that, right? So this is an important distinction. The results show that in the same gender configuration, gender declared by the operator who wrote the message and the gender declared by the annotator are the same. The appreciation was expressed 47% of the time, while it decreased to 32% in a different gender configuration. So essentially, if the operator and the annotator had different gender, then the appreciation was much lower, around 15% lower. This is also statistically significant. So even if the operators were following the same guideline and were instructed on the same possible arguments to build counter narratives, there is still an effect of their gender on the produced text, and this effect contributes to the counter narrative preference in the same gender configuration. All right. So now we have the conclusion of the paper. As online hate speech content rises massively, responding to it is necessary, right? And counter narratives are there to do that. Counter narrative trained models can be the future, and this would also be in compliance with the freedom of expression argument, where people claim, okay, so what if I posted something? This is a part of my freedom of expression. Yep. So if instead of banning those accounts, if there is a choice for the reader or the participant to actively make a choice of choosing the right or choosing the correct facts or learning the right facts, then that would be a good first step or a good leap in this direction. So in this paper, they describe Conan, and finally the dataset contains 478 pairs over the three languages. Together with the collected data, they also provide a lot of metadata. And as future work, we intend to continue collecting more data for Islam and to include other hate targets such as migrants or LGBT plus, in order to put the dataset at service of other organizations for the research. Moreover, as a future direction, we want to utilize CONAN dataset to develop a counter narrative generation tool that can provide NGOs that can support NGOs in fighting online hate speech. So this was a very novel dataset, and they've thanked all of these associations for helping. It was supported by Hate Meter project, and they're also grateful to the NGOs and all annotators, Stop Hate UK, Collective Contre, and Les Islamophobes and France, Amnesty International. And I guess we're probably done. I hope you liked this thing series. Maybe I'll do these more often now, but no promises. And thank you guys for watching, and hope to see you again pretty soon.